Prior to the cancellation of Interplay's ill-fated attempt at Fallout 3, many of the same designers worked on an ambitious, sprawling fantasy RPG that would sadly never see the light of day. This is the development and demise of the Black Hound. Baldur's Gate 3 The Black Hound was known internally at Black Isle as Project Jefferson or FR6. Relatively little is known about the project in comparison to Van Buren, but at some point in late 2000 or early 2001, a small team led by Josh Sawyer began work on the Baldur's Gate sequel. Its development was concurrent with the IceWind Dale 2 expansion Heart of Winter, but didn't have a full development team until after that game's final expansion was released in July of 2001. It was planned to use D&D's 3rd edition rule set, which was newly released at this point, and would have taken place in the Forgotten Realms setting, a fantasy world of bizarre lands, dangerous creatures, and powerful deities, where magic and supernatural phenomena are a common occurrence. More specifically, it would have been set in the Dalelands region, a locale of dense forest and rolling farmland, composed of a loosely organized group of countries called Dales. While previous Baldur's Gate games and Interplay titles like Planescape Torment utilized BioWare's Infinity Engine, there was a sentiment that the engine had been overused. Inspired by BioWare's new Aurora engine, Black Isle instead opted to recreate their own new engine, codenamed the Ferguson Engine. Ferguson was built with the D&D rule set in mind, and allowed the use of 3D character models rather than the sprites that most Interplay games had featured up until this point. Two of the core aspects of the game world was being able to explore in a non-linear fashion and a robust karma system that forced you to face the consequences of the quest you failed or didn't complete. Josh Sawyer spoke about the engine's creation, stating, "The Infinity Engine was already being used quite extensively, to put it mildly, at Black Isle. We saw what BioWare was doing with Aurora, and we really wanted to make our own 3D engine that had better static lighting, more modular game rules, and a more extensible equipment system, among other things. Our engine was over-engineered in many ways, occasionally to our detriment. Our static lighting looked fantastic, but the pipeline for getting levels built and lit was very error-prone. Our game logic was constructed very carefully to allow virtually anything that D&D rules allow. On the IceWind Dale series, we were often blocked during implementation by engineering decisions that prevented us from implementing a given item, spell, special ability, etc. We really wanted to avoid that on the Black Hound, but the process for building effect trees could be troublesome due to the sheer number of options. On the graphic side of things, we had great character and monster customization systems. Without going into excessive detail, both systems allowed for a large amount of character variety. The monsters had it particularly good. On one of our mine levels, over 60 goblins populated the level, and each one had a unique appearance, though the collective goblin mesh took up a relatively small memory footprint. The visual effects system was also powerful. Our artists created some truly spectacular visual effects for spells, weapons, and special attacks. No gameplay footage ever leaked, unfortunately, and the only other game to use the engine was Fallout 3, which was also cancelled. Josh Sawyer shared an image of his desktop which depicts a screenshot that's rumored to be from the Black Hound, but this was never confirmed. Senior 3D artist Glenn Price worked on much of the game's character art, and through the following images, we're given an idea of how these models would have appeared in-game. He also revealed how these outfits were made, saying, quote, "On Baldur's Gate 3, I did most of the male outfits. These were modeled using Lightwave and textured using a combination of Deep Paint, Painter, and Photoshop. All of the races use the same geometry and texture maps. We use morph targets, blend shapes, to shape the character into different races. Characters used a 512 by 512 map for the skin, outfits, and all accessories." Unquote. He also shared renders of levels like this image that depicts the Tower of Dracandos, a large dungeon that would have been found in Battledale. The closest idea we have to how it would have looked and played is Van Buren's leaked tech demo. Like Fallout games before it, it utilized tile-based maps, but Black Isle intended to evolve the series by including 3D models, static lighting, real-time combat with a pause function, weather systems, and rotating camera angles, features that also would have been present in Jefferson. This is because the engine was essentially the same throughout the development of both games, as Josh Sawyer divulged. The technology used for Jefferson the Black Hound was later used for Van Buren, Black Isle's Fallout 3. I don't think we made that many changes to the underlying technology between projects. There wasn't time to, really. We brought the grid size down because our Fallout environments were more grid-based than the Black Hound's. And obviously we switched the rule set over, but those were relatively minor changes. The data formats, lighting model, etc. remained largely the same. I believe Obsidian still has the code for it. I've referenced a few things from the tools and design conventions from time to time, but otherwise it hasn't been used. It's quite old tech at this point, with the codebase stretching back to around 2001. Little is known about the Black Hound story, but we can piece together a basic synopsis from several developer quotes. First up is John Daly, a designer who worked on Fallout 2, Van Buren, and Jefferson. It had little to do with the original Baldur's Gate series. It was a beautiful story of the player, who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and finds himself wrapped in a web of intrigue, lies, and mysteries. I know that's very vague, but that's where I'm going to leave it. Baldur's Gate 3 was the child of Josh Sawyer, who I respect very much. He put his heart and soul into the design of that game, and its cancellation left a deep wound. If there is anything more to say about it, I leave it to him. During an interview, Damian Folletto, who also worked on both Jefferson and Van Buren, disclosed more information regarding the Black Hound's plot and its inspiration from the 1985 Terry Gilliam film Brazil. I know Josh was a fan of Brazil, and I know that there were ideas that were borrowed, but Baldur's Gate 3's story was original. As for plot, here's the Cliff Notes version of Jefferson. You're a wandering, non-chosen one sap caught in a rainstorm. You seek shelter under a nearby tree adjacent to a dilapidated windmill. As you shiver next to a campfire, a crazy lady and her rogue minions crash your party chasing a large black hound. An arrow kills the hound and it flops onto your lap. The crazy lady, who looks like a cleric by the way she's dressed, accuses you of being in cahoots with the hound and threatens to kill you as well. Luckily, riders of Arkandale come to your rescue and scare off the madwoman cleric. However, your troubles have just started because you're hauled away for questioning. After a brief inquisition, the local magistrates tell you not to wander far because they may have more questions. And so your adventure begins to find out who the mad cleric was, what this has to do with you, why a black spirit hound now follows you around, and why can't people just leave you alone and do things for themselves. On another occasion, Josh Sawyer gave his own synopsis of the game's plot. The Black Hound catches the central player in the wrong place at the wrong time. In this case, the wrong place is south of Whiteford, Arkandale, and the wrong time is the night when a woman tracks down and kills a Black Hound. The protagonist is a witness to this strange event and becomes entangled with the woman, May Farrow, through association. Many people and many groups want information on May and believe that the protagonist can help them get what they want. The player has a pretty broad long-term goal: find May Farrow and deal with her. This can be accomplished with or without factions in the area, and it can be accomplished by helping or hindering May in various ways. There are also numerous side stories and faction plot lines that have nothing to do with May Farrow's plot directly. Over the course of the game, the protagonist is likely to visit many points of interest in Arkandale, Deependale, and Battledale. For the realms impaired, these are the three southernmost regions of the Dale Lands. They sit north of Sembia, southwest of the Moonsea, and northeast of Cormyr. In a separate post, he continued, "The main antagonist of the story, though she herself is the object of a massive hunt, is a human woman named May Farrow. May is the leader of a group of bandits that has been selectively attacking merchant routes across the southern Dale lands. The Arkan Riders and other groups have had a great deal of difficulty tracking her. Even the elves of Deependale can't follow her far into the Dark Watch. In the months prior to the beginning of the game, May has become reckless. The Arkan Riders have almost captured her on several occasions due to her apparent obsession with hunting down a Black Hound. Her success in this endeavor is the event that draws the protagonist into her nasty world. The other major NPCs tend to be faction leaders that will try to either woo or hinder the protagonist. Stellaga Brightstar, High Priestess of the Church of Lathander, has a special interest in May. The Red Wizards of Thay, the Symbian Silver Ravens, and even the Malorite people of the Black Blood are also watching her movements very closely. The relationship of each group to May should hopefully surprise a lot of players. In Synopsis, the first chapter would have taken place in Arkandale, and opened outside the small, sleepy town of Lightford. On a dark and dreary night, a storm rages and the player takes cover from the rain beneath a tree. You're soon approached by the Black Hound, a dog who's been hunted for weeks by an insane cleric named Mayfarrow and her band of vicious raiders. She looses an arrow that kills the Black Hound and its corpse falls into your lap. As the Black Hound dies, its spirit becomes soulbound to you, giving the player character the ability to see and interact with the guilt of others. May sees you as in league with the Black Hound, tries to kill the player and nearly succeeds, but at the last moment you're saved when the Riders of Arkandale appear, forcing the bandits to flee for their lives. The Riders take you to their magistrate at the game's first settlement, Arkenbridge, the capital and only major town in Arkandale. After arriving, you would be questioned, then restricted from leaving the Dalelands region. Afterwards, the player could roam freely through the city, which would have been the single largest area in the game, featuring a staggering number of characters, side quests, and maps. The player would then visit various locations throughout the Dalelands, attempting to discover what had happened to them, and stop Mayfarrow and her murderous band. Each chapter would take place in a different country of the Dalelands, starting in Arkandale, then traveling to Deependale, Battledale, and Tasseldale, before finally reaching the Tangled Vale, each of which would feature a large number of areas. The title's slogan was, "You can't kill guilt," and fittingly the player would learn that the Black Hound couldn't be killed, and that they couldn't undo what they had become. Eventually, you'd learn the tragic tale of Mayfarrow, a widow who felt overwhelming guilt for the death of her husband and tried to resurrect him, but instead created a monstrous abomination that feeds off of the guilt of others. The Black Hound wasn't a mere dog, but rather a physical manifestation of Mayfarrow's guilt for unleashing a great evil, and she believed that killing it would stop her husband. The final chapter took place in the Tangled Vale, featuring ominously named maps like the Dark Road, the Vale of Lost Voices, and the Cathedral of Celestial Morning. The game's ending has never been confirmed, but given what we know, I suspect this would eventually lead to a final confrontation with Mayfarrow's late husband, now a powerful monster who has been feeding off of the guilt of others via the Black Hound that latched onto the player. Presumably he had become a threat to the entire region, and only the player could stop him from destroying everything and everyone. Despite using the Baldur's Gate namesake, the Black Hound actually had no relation to previous games in the Baldur's Gate series beyond taking place in the Forgotten Realms setting, and using a D&D rule set. The use of the title only came about because of a contract issue with Hasbro, as Josh Sawyer revealed. It's been a long time since I worked on the Black Hound, but I want to make it clear again that I never had any intention of the game being called Baldur's Gate 3 or Baldur's Gate whatever. Interplay put that title on it after well over a year and a half of development had been done. They did it for contractual issues they had. They were only allowed to publish D&D games with Baldur's Gate or IceWind Dale in the title. I and many others on the team expressed concern over tacking the name onto a game that was made to be its own thing, not an Infinity Engine / Baldur's Gate game. In the end, it didn't really matter, but I think it's important to note that the team's intention was never to use the Baldur's Gate name. The title would have apparently capped you and your party at level 8, and according to several interviews, the Black Hound was actually the first title in an epic D&D trilogy that would have seen releases through 2005. If this had happened, it would have made Baldur's Gate one of the most confusing game series ever made, as the first two games developed by BioWare would have been completely unrelated to Black Isle's 3rd, 4th, and 5th releases. Despite that, I can't help but long for a world where Black Isle got to complete a D&D trilogy and the Fallout trilogy, but c'est la vie. While FR6 bore no connection to the Baldur's Gate series, it was partially linked to another Black Isle production, IceWind Dale 2. The opening cinematic is narrated by a young gnome girl named Marilee Fiddlebender, a character who appears in some sections of the campaign. She was planned to be one of Jefferson's potential companions, and the cinematic even features the eponymous Black Hound, as Damien Filetto revealed. Josh can give better details than I since it was his story, but Marilee was going to be one of the player's potential party members, but all grown up. Wouldn't be very useful if she was still a kid, eh? Unless she was like the Omen or something, but that's a different story. The dog, or Black Hound, was an integral part of the storyline. It represented a haunted past of a main bad guy's selfish indiscretions and non-accountability. The Hound gets spiritually bonded with the player through circumstance, and is a non-too-subtle reminder of the player's actions throughout the game. Too bad this Hound isn't real. I can think of one political leader who needs a bit of haunting right now. Josh Sawyer talked about it as well, saying, "The only connection it had was with IceWind Dale. Marilee Fiddlebender was a companion. It had no connection to Baldur's Gate at all. It was planned as far back as IceWind Dale 2. The opening of IceWind Dale 2 features Marilee as the narrator, reading an account of the events of that game while she's at the Leaves of Learning in High Moon. You would have found her at the exact same spot that's pictured in the IceWind Dale 2 opening. It's strange that Interplay's upper management mandated the Baldur's Gate name rather than IceWind Dale, since it at least had some connection to the latter, and is yet another example of how out of touch Interplay was with Black Isle's games. In a post on the Interplay forums, Josh Sawyer talked about how companions would have reacted to the player's actions, as well as the other companions in your party depending on their unique disposition. Companion NPCs who are willing to join the protagonist are also initially willing to let the protagonist command them, just like Baldur's Gate style NPCs. CNPCs have particular behaviors that they like or dislike. Behaviors like wild, hateful, idealistic, sentimental, unprofessional, or loyal. When they see the protagonist taking actions that support these behavior types, their bias skills towards the protagonist move up or down. Typically, they will clearly let the protagonist know they are unhappy with the things he or she is doing. At a certain low cutoff point, modified by the protagonist's charisma among other things, the CNPCs stop trusting the protagonist. They may choose to leave, or in very severe cases attack the protagonist. The CNPCs can never be used as the speaker for the party, but they may interject with their opinions or insights from time to time. You may be wondering why you would ever bother increasing the speech skills of these CNPCs, or taking good speaker characters at all. CNPCs also have bias skills and breakpoints towards each other. If/when the CNPCs reach breakpoints and start arguing with each other, they may need to use their own charisma and speech skills to avoid conflict with the other party members. Of course, the protagonist quite often has the ability to calm down the CNPCs through the use of his or her own speech skills. So in summary, a low charisma, low speech skill protagonist will typically only be able to take CNPCs that do not have inherent conflicts with each other or the protagonist's behavior. A high charisma, high speech skill protagonist will often be able to keep a diverse group of CNPCs together, in spite of their own conflicts and his or her own questionable behavior. In another Twitter post, Josh Sawyer shared some images of the design documents and talked about the game's largest settlement, Arkenbridge. Cool to look at an area design document I wrote in 2003 for the Black Hound. It's for one city. It's 52 pages long, outlines 90 maps, 80 unique speaking characters, and 40 quests, all crimes for which I should have been / should be justly executed. He then mentioned the game was planned to have a staggering number of levels. LMAO, a mere 482 maps. Please travel back in time and shoot me in the face. Finally, he talked about a dungeon inspired by the labyrinth called the Enchanted Garden that would have appeared in the second chapter. Mwahaha! Would you like to journey to my homage to Labyrinth? Please enter the 15 maps of the Enchanted Garden with its own custom tile set and unique things found nowhere else in the game. No, it's not on the critical path. Thank you. The Enchanted Garden seems to have been a massive hedge maze that surrounded a multi-level manor, and was defended by creatures like zombies, giant bees, and monstrous spiders. It was controlled by a powerful wizard, and your primary goal was to stop some kind of nefarious experimentation he was performing. It featured side quests like relocate the Red Wizards of Thay, gather rare plants for Miltipo, and investigate the abnormal animals. Interestingly, some of the assets for the game ended up appearing in Van Buren's tech demo, like this zombie texture sheet that was almost certainly intended to be an enemy. The most obvious leftover is a texture for some kind of castle or dungeon door / room. There's been some discussion as to whether the Deathclaw texture sheet is for an actual Deathclaw, or if it's a recycled creature from FR6, which is ironic because Deathclaws were inspired by the Tarrasque creature from D&D. There's also a snow weather mechanic, and as far as I'm aware, there's no location in Van Buren that would have featured snow, so this seems to be a leftover from the Black Hound as well. Most intriguing is the fact that the entirety of the Global's Any in Van Buren was ripped straight out of Jefferson, and features a long list of early quest stage variables. First, we can gather the difficulty of skill checks would have varied from trivial to epic. One line mentions talking to a character named Murrid about a lycanthrope, implying that we might have gotten some werewolf action. Some variables refer to an NPC named Alejandra who was kidnapped, and the player could apparently find her inside a mine, then bring her back home. Another series of variables mentions police, followed by banished, contraband, murder, and theft. Perhaps these were punishments for the player's potential actions. One line teases a quest that would have appeared in the Veil of Lost Voices, where the player needed to recover the bones of a fallen hero. One section mentions the player could promise 3 separate characters, including Merrily, that they would return to set a NPC named Keldine free. Considering that we know Merrily was intended as a companion, it's plausible that the other 2 characters mentioned here, Bastine and Edward, were also potential companions. Bastine apparently could have been freed from prison, but there's little other information regarding these mysterious characters. A single variable hints at a fated knight, and tracks if the player has heard of Andraxi's legend. Perhaps the most interesting notes refer to a quest revolving around a character named Acadian, who asks the player to find youth potions. After finding them, a cutscene could occur where he'd drink the potion and become young again. He would have betrayed the player at some point during the quest, and was taking revenge on something that occurred 150 years in the past, related to a person or perhaps a location called Summer Day. In the end, the player could either kill him or strike a truce. Josh Sawyer mentioned one of the game's side quests in a Twitter post that reads, "On the Black Hound we had a quest to rescue a small child. You could equip the child in your back slot and wear her, Papu style. The real question here is how much does wearing a child improve your armor class?" By 2003, Jefferson was reportedly 75% complete, but was tragically cancelled when Interplay lost the rights to make Baldur's Gate titles for PC in exchange for an extension on their Baldur's Gate console contract. Interplay was in dire financial straits and prioritized a hack-and-slash console game with more mass appeal, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2. This would ironically be Black Isle's final title, as their parent company went bankrupt not long afterwards and closed the division. Josh Sawyer commented on its cancellation, stating, "I'm not sure how much I can say definitively about why they shut down the project, but coincidentally, Interplay lost the rights to use the Baldur's Gate brand name on PC immediately prior to canceling the project." Chris Avallone provided his own take on Jefferson's cancellation, stating, "I worked on Baldur's Gate 3, also known as the Black Hound, but it didn't share much in common with the original franchise, so even though I was working on it, it was difficult to get as excited about it as the Baldur's Gate franchise itself. I was worried its disconnect in terms of story, antagonists, premise, companions, gameplay, and even priorities were all different than Baldur's Gate itself. And I was worried it would also be off-putting to players expecting a return to the original series. In the end, when Baldur's Gate 3 got cancelled, I felt bad for the amount of work that was put into it. It had some gorgeous art and some great level design. But I didn't mourn the loss of the engine, and I didn't mourn the loss of the design content, narrative and otherwise. I didn't think it would have measured up to what made the original Baldur's Gate special, unfortunately. Black Isle just didn't have the same focus BioWare did, or the same heart for the series. Not long after Baldur's Gate 3 got cancelled, due to a supposed accounting error which caused the studio to lose the D&D license, I resigned. It felt as if any more work we did on RPGs had the same chance of getting cancelled, no matter how hard we worked on it. It was especially difficult to resign, as Baldur's Gate 3's loss meant we could switch gears and finally have a team working on Fallout Van Buren, Black Isle's Fallout 3. And I had spent years putting together the design for it, but I felt that what happened to Baldur's Gate 3 would happen to Fallout Van Buren. And within a year of my departure, right before Christmas, Interplay canceled Van Buren as well. I felt bad for the team, but at the same time, the writing had been on the wall for some time. The year after Project Jefferson's cancellation, Atari put out a press release teasing that Baldur's Gate 3 was in production, but provided no other details. The first Neverwinter Nights was developed by BioWare and published by Atari, so perhaps BioWare was considered, but nothing else would materialize and the project would remain in limbo once more. That is until 3 years later in 2007, when Josh Sawyer attempted to cast Raised Dead and single-handedly recreate the Black Hound as a Neverwinter Nights 2 mod. Black Isle RPGs were known for their reputation-based reactivity to the player's actions, and in Jefferson this would have taken the form of epithets, as Josh Sawyer revealed. Epithets are specialized reputations that are built over time across the campaign. Unlike local reputations that may only affect interactions with NPCs within a set of maps, epithets draw reactions from characters all over the campaign, though they are very spread out. The system itself is pretty simple. Each epithet has a global variable that is incremented in conversation and occasionally outside of conversation. When the character has increased that particular variable enough, they will be awarded with the epithet, which takes the form of a feat. The feat has no statistical bonus, but is occasionally checked in NPC conversations. He then shared an image depicting several epithets and their unique icons, including reputations like Merciful Victor, Corpse Raven, Charitable Benefactor, Arrogant Bitch, and my favorite, Notorious Prude. This is particularly interesting because epithets are referenced in Jefferson's global script found in Van Buren, like Cruel and Mercenary. In the same post, he also expanded on several of the game's major factions. There are about 8 different factions that have prominent roles in the game, with varying levels of interest in the central plot. 2 that emerge very quickly are the Silver Ravens of Symbia and the Red Wizards of Thay. The former are ostensibly an Archon bridge to oppose the foundation of an enclave by the latter. The Silver Ravens are a tricky group to deal with for a few reasons. Almost without exception, they have an insufferable level of nationalistic pride. They also run a wide gamut of moral and ethical boundaries. Some Silver Ravens are noble and forthright, others are incredibly despicable, and the rest fall somewhere in the middle. To use their own phrase, the Silver Ravens are a tangled basket, often operating in an intricate and dizzying fashion, with various subgroups being completely unaware of the goals and actions being taken by the others. In contrast, the Red Wizards of Thay are sharply divided on their goals in the Dales. Beyond their interest in Mayfaro, the Enclave regularly quarrels about their political policy, trade agreements, and even how they present themselves in public. The official leader of the group is a reasonable young enchanter named Kayed Mar. He is regularly opposed by an older invoker of the old, kill 'em all, let Kelim-Vor sort 'em out school, named Fuel Zadakar. Beneath these two figures are an array of wizards and slaves that have varying allegiances and levels of political concern. At least two of the wizards seem more interested in testing the insulating properties of rubber from a shocking grasp on a cat. Unfortunately, the mod would never be released, and the dream of the Black Hound would be quietly snuffed out for the final time. After the cancellation of Fallout 3 and the end of Black Isle, many of the developers who worked on Jefferson would move on to Obsidian Entertainment. In 2007, Obsidian made a pitch to Atari for another crack at Baldur's Gate 3, who held the rights to D&D at the time. Fergus Urquhart recounted the pitch, saying, "We were working with Atari a lot on Neverwinter Nights too. That culminated in a really serious conversation about Baldur's Gate 3, so much so that we were working on agreements, and we actually had a team working on things. We were working out what it was that we thought Baldur's Gate 3 should be, as we worked through things with Atari on the legal side. A key part of Baldur's Gate is the sense of exploration. The Forgotten Realms has all of these cool places you can go to, and you can't just create one 1,000 kilometer open world. We were looking at the idea of having fairly large areas, but not one contiguous area, so that we could show these iconic, new, or interesting parts of the Forgotten Realms. The deal was reportedly close to being signed, but everything fell apart in 2008 when Atari Europe was sold to Namco. Once again, Baldur's Gate 3 had been taken away from the team that so desperately wanted to make it. Nearly a decade after its cancellation, Josh Sawyer made a retrospective post about FR6 on the Obsidian forums. In the course of following our countdown over at Obsidian, a lot of gamers have been discussing past IPs we've worked with. One of the common subjects is the Black Hound, a project some of us at Obsidian Entertainment Inc. worked on at Black Isle. It's also something I worked on as a Neverwinter Nights 2 mod in my spare time. There's a Wikipedia entry for it and a few lore sites kicking around. Some of the info on it is accurate and some isn't, but I think the details are less important than what we were trying to do with it. I can't speak for everyone who was on the project, of course, but the Black Hound was important to me for a lot of reasons. When I came to Black Isle, the majority of the studio was working on Planescape Torment. I was the webmaster for that project, but I desperately wanted to work in development as a designer. I had spent a huge amount of personal time in the 90s playing 2nd edition AD&D in the Forgotten Realms. Working on IceWind Dale was a dream come true. Yeah, the game had a smaller story focus, and yeah, it didn't have companions. And yeah, it was linear and dungeon focused, but I was making a real AD&D video game in the Forgotten Realms. IceWind Dale 2 is the first game I was credited as lead designer on, but I was the lead designer on the Black Hound first. I felt the Dale lands, bordering on the Moonsea, presented a cool subsection of the realms and a crossroad of cultures that would be interesting to explore. We built a personal story, focused on how you fatefully intersected the life of someone hell-bent on doing something crazy. Like many Realms adventures, this wasn't a world-shattering event, but something locally catastrophic, like Moander appearing near a town and devouring a huge swath of the landscape. It's just one of those crazy realm stories where bands of adventurers in the Cult of the Dragon start throwing fireballs and leveling villages while the townsfolk run for cover. Some people have suggested that I hate high fantasy or want to subvert high fantasy. Neither of those are really true. I just don't like how most stories handle high fantasy, both too seriously and not seriously enough. Too seriously in the sense that a lot of fantasy conventions are considered so sacred that you can't touch them, or even question them. Not seriously enough in the sense that the scenarios and the characters don't feel like they tackle the obvious questions raised by the settings they're placed in. As an example, the Red Wizards of Thay, a Forgotten Realms magical organization slash magocracy, underwent a transformation between 2nd edition and 3rd edition. They became a kinder, gentler trading nation, forming magical mercantile enclaves and lands that would let them in. The thing is, 2nd edition slash 3rd edition Red Wizards probably look pretty weird to Cormians and Dalesmen. They shave their heads, including the women, speak a different language, and have a lot of magical tattoos. They're also darker skinned. After a few centuries of being regarded as pariahs everywhere west of the River Sur, they show up in these places and are doing business. Questionable business in broad daylight. The Forgotten Realms designers did something interesting in shifting their MO between 2nd edition and 3rd edition. The not interesting thing to do, in my opinion, with that shift as a scenario or story designer, would be to have a pack of bad guy Thayans in an enclave with the good guy locals saying, "Those darn Thayans are up to something. Please help us, heroes." I was intrigued by the idea that a Thayan enclave could include a new guard of diplomatic red wizards and an old guard of fireball-hurling hardasses who aren't allowed or are discouraged from going outside. Some of the new guard genuinely want to mend fences. Others simply want to use it as a way to re-establish safe power centers and observation posts in lands where they previously would have been killed on sight. The new guard uses concealing/lightning makeup, dons wigs, and wears Western clothing to fit in. The old guard chafes at having to conceal their heritage, and suffers under the jeers and slurs of locals if they dare to appear in public. The new guard speaks with good and proper common grammar and pronunciation, not stumbling over foreign sounds and linguistic concepts. I thought it would create a more interesting and nuanced relationship between the Thayans, the Dalesmen, and those who interacted with them, lending sympathy to the traditionally villainous, and creating a more agonizing struggle between the subfactions of the Thayans. An old wizard who strokes his beard and cackles as he unleashes chain lightning on random townsfolk isn't particularly sympathetic. But suppose he were a veteran red wizard who watched his fellows succumb over the years in service to the Zulkirs and was forced to step aside as young diplomats smooth-talk their way into trade relationships with their former enemies. He has to endure the insults of locals, hear them mock his clothing, his pronunciation, his skin, his culture, and when he expresses his frustration to his new, younger superiors, he's treated like an anachronism, an old artillery cannon left to rust and rot on a forgotten battlefield. That dude may still wind up casting chain lightning on townsfolk, but if we weave a compelling story around him, the player should feel that there's more to him than that. I've been rambling here a bit, but let me get back to the main point. The Black Hound wasn't really subversive. This ain't your daddy's RPG fantasy. It had Ilmatarian paladins and Mastican sorcerers and crypts full of undead. All the stuff that made the Forgotten Realms the crazy blend of hard-ass adventure-heavy, gods messing with things, cults and Draco-liches under this rock, D&D fantasy it always has been. And I think we all, just tried to approach the world with open eyes, asking, okay, so let's suppose that all of this stuff about the realms is true. What does that really mean for how the people in it live their lives? It made the world more dark and grim, and sometimes that consideration wound up bucking convention. But we didn't set out to invert fantasy conventions just for the sake of doing it. I regret that the team wasn't able to complete the Black Hound, and not just because of the time and passion we all invested in it. Some of my best tabletop RPG and CRPG memories came out of the Forgotten Realms. Huge, crazy, how many more Volos guides can there be, Forgotten Realms? I think those scenarios were memorable because the DM/designers made compelling scenarios and the players gave a damn about each other and what was going on. If you take fantasy for granted, yeah, no one's going to get much out of it. I don't think we took anything for granted. We had an opportunity to make something that celebrated high fantasy without being enslaved by its conventions. In retrospect, there are a bunch of personal design choices I look back on and cringe at, but I don't regret the time I spent on it at all. When you enjoy the process of making something that much, it's hard to consider it time wasted. We had a lot of fun while it lasted. In 2015, Obsidian crowdfunded Pillars of Eternity and made an amazing homage to their lost love by naming an inn the Black Hound. One of the art assets displayed here is Baldur's Gate 3's box art, which was made by Vance Kovacs, a fitting tip of the hat to a game we'll never have a chance to play. The owner of the inn, Pasca, mentions that she took over after the previous owner disappeared, a reference to a Kickstarter backer who paid for a package that let them design their own inn, but they never actually claimed their reward. Pasca also tells you the inn was named after the previous owner's animal, a black dog that still resides in the location's second level. The Black Hound can even be recruited as a pet. Junior designer Olivia Veras talked about how all of this came to be.
There's a couple of jokes in here about the inn's previous owner having disappeared, you might note, and that grew out of our never hearing back from the inn backer. It's all meant in good fun, of course. I had a little poster in my office of the old promo art for Baldur's Gate 3, and while we were thinking of names for this place, I started using the Black Hound as a placeholder, thinking that it wouldn't stick. It ended up getting the thumbs up, and Josh Sawyer asked Art to implement the poster image as a stained glass window on the lower floor. The dog upstairs actually came later. Once we started assigning locations to the various pets, the placement for the black dog seemed fairly obvious.
Josh Sawyer commented on it as well. There are some mechanical things that we carried over. For example, the reputation system that tracks different personality types and has people react differently to the certain personality that you gave your character. That was something that we initially conceived for Jefferson. Obviously, the name of the inn in the first town being the Black Hound is not a coincidence. But I would say that almost all of the other stuff we wound up putting in the game was a whole cloth. I mean, I shouldn't say whole cloth because it draws inspiration from the Forgotten Realms and a lot of other games. But the story is very different from what we were doing with Baldur's Gate 3, and really none of the characters came over. It was its own thing. Although obviously we tried to invoke the feeling of the Forgotten Realms and the Dale lands especially. Larian Studios is currently planning to release Baldur's Gate 3 later this year, well over 20 years after Black Isle first attempted it. Their version will undoubtedly be a more fitting entry to that series than Jefferson would have been. But that doesn't make the Black Hound's cancellation any less painful. The first entry of a trilogy that by all accounts would have been an evolution of the RPG genre, one that might have saved Black Isle and all the dreams their developers hoped to share. A truly unique fantasy world that vanished before ever entering ours, and was ultimately left on the cutting room floor.